Good morning again. This is George Baker. This is our second installment of a series of comments about second language acquisition with particular attention to English and Spanish. A few months back, someone approached me and said, "Hey, I'd like you to give me some tutoring on how to free up my ability to speak English from the overhang, the Mexican accent that I continue to have in English." This is someone who speaks English on television as a very proficient speaker of English, but he realizes that there are still elements of his native language formation that intrude upon English. This person's name is Marco. The first amusing side of listening to him was realizing that he mispronounces his own name in English. In English, we have a word called mark, which is both a first name and a common noun, and a verb too. The detail is that the R and the K are blended at the end. So linguists take a syllable and divide it into three parts. The beginning part is called the onset. The middle part is called the nucleus, and the end is called the coda, as in music. English and Spanish are very different in the way they think about onsets and codas. In Spanish, most onsets and codas are single letters. In fact, there's only very few blended onsets and blended codas in Spanish. By blended, I mean two or more, in Spanish only two consonants together that would together form either an onset or a coda. So in English, you have dozens of possibilities for both the onset and the coda. The situation of Marco is that because there is no blended RK coda in Spanish, he says his name when he's speaking in English. "Hi, my name is Marco." Well, that's great, but that's not English. We don't say Marco. We say Marco. Marco. Do you hear it? Do you hear the difference between Marco and Marco? Well, Marco doesn't sound like Spanish, but it's not supposed to be. It's supposed to be English. Maybe that's a misleading example because we're using someone's name, and you might say, well, he should say his name in Spanish. On the other hand, this person is trying to say, I want to come across as a native English speaker. So in that case, you don't say Marco, you say Marco. I've made a list of blended codas, of all the combinations of letters that can come together at the end of words in English. And I think there's about 100 different combinations. I'm sure I don't have them all. For the letter R alone, I have something like 30 combinations of R. So we've seen the example of RK, as in Marco, which is sounded as Mark, but there's another 30 more combinations of R. So that tells us that, or that illustrates to us that we're not listening. We're not listening to the other language as it is spoken. We're listening to how we imagine the language is spoken, and we hear it and we stick to that for decades. We'll stick to Marco and never hear that it's Marco. So that's today's lesson, that we have to realize that we're not hearing the language we're trying to get proficient in. We're not hearing it precisely as it is spoken. And to break out of that, again, we need to go into linguistics. We need to go into the theory about how that language moves air around. And only in that way, in educating the mind, will the ears begin to hear. And when the ears begin to hear, the body will respond. And the body will start to move air around in ways that correspond to that language. Thank you.